Well, greetings everyone and my grandkids. Here we are once again to talk about and have read, or will be reading to you, the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution by none other than J.T. Headley. That was, it was put together and published in 1864. And just as a reminder, is that Mr. Headley put this together and he compiled this book so that we could remember, and that history was not giving us the fact and the truth and the reality of how important the pastors and how important the chaplains were in the whole foundation of America. And geez, as you know, I mentioned way back at the beginning of the book, is that today the clergy, the pastors, the churches, the church leaders, let alone the historians, don't talk about how important the pastors and the churches were. So with that, let's do what we have been doing and reading this on the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution that was published in 1864. And we are on chapter 11 of 46 chapters. And the person today, and for this one, is William TENNENT. And we're going to be talking about his birth and education. He settled in Norwalk, Connecticut. He removes, which means he moves. He just wasn't removed. He moves to Charleston, South Carolina. His personal appearance, his eloquence, his boldness and zeal in the cause of the colonies. He makes a patriotic appeal on the Sabbath, is elected member of the Provincial Congress of South Carolina. How many pastors are willing to be elected into political office today? Well, you talk about politics and they run from it. They run from it. So here it is. Wow. Sent with Henry Drayton to the back settlements to baffle the Tories. That'll be interesting. His letters to Henry Lawrence and the Congress, again sent to Congress. His character and his death. The tenants seemed to be of the Aaronic line, and William was a favorite name in the various branches of the family. There were 3 William tenants who early devoted themselves to the cause of their master. And when they say their master, this was in capital letters, so they were talking about the Lord God. And when the revolution broke out, made the cause of their country one with it. The clergyman, whose name stands at the head of this sketch, is sometimes called William Tennent III, to distinguish him from the other celebrated William Tennents, and was born in Freehold, New Jersey in 1740. Gifted with a fine intellect, he made such a rapid progress in his early studies that he graduated at Princeton when but 18 years of age. Wow. As many of our founding fathers, and that is that they actually finished college by the time they were 18 and ready to go to college when they were 13 or 14. Anyway, sorry, we'll just keep going back and forth. Papa always has to take and interject something here. Okay, so he was licensed to preach in 1761 and labored as an itinerant for 6 months under the direction of Hanover Presbytery of Virginia. So children, an itinerant was a pastor, a preacher that got up, he either walked or he got up on horseback, and he would go from church to church and different communities, and he would be the pastor, because a lot of the smaller churches and a lot of the congregations and the villages and towns out there, they just couldn't have or afford to have a regular pastor. So an itinerant pastor was someone that would go around to all of these other places. So, and the Hanover Presbytery was more of a Presbyterian type of organization, church where he was out of. In 1765, he was settled at Norwalk, Connecticut, where he remained a little over 6 years. At the end of that period, he received a call from an independent church in Charleston, South Carolina. And though for a time the church at Norwalk refused to part with him, they finally gave a reluctant consent, and he was installed pastor in the former church. He was laboring here when the storm of revolution broke over the land. So what happened was that the church there in Norwalk really liked him a lot, and they didn't want him to go. They weren't going to release him. Much different than in some of the congregations and churches where they move pastors around, or how they work the process today. And it's a little different. So he went down there, and then everything was going on with the revolution. The contest at once enlisted his whole heart, and he threw himself into it with a boldness and a zeal that astonished and troubled some of even his best friends. Wow. He was of a manly presence, vivid imagination, great beauty of person, and lofty genius. Consciousness of his great powers made him bold and enterprising, and he became a great favorite with the people. Said one who knew him well, over his dead body, quote, his honest, disinterested, yet glowing zeal for his country's good demands from us a tribute of respect. Impressed with the sense of justness, greatness, and vast importance of the American cause, he engaged in it with an ardor and resolution that would have done honor to an ancient Roman. For this he was indeed censured, and perhaps too liberally, by his friends. Early in the contest, he magnanimously stepped forth as an advocate for this continent. Here was a field suited to his great abilities, and here his abilities shone with an increasing luster. He first endeavored to rouse his fellow citizens to a just sense of their inestimable rights and a willingness to contend for them, and to his spirited exertions, among others, may in a great measure be attributed that noble patriotic zeal which soon blazed forth to the immortal honor of this state, end quote. And that was the state of South Carolina, where he went, right? Okay. Being at the center of influence in the province, his eloquent appeals reached those who controlled its destinies. He rarely preached political sermons, but so wholly did he feel the struggle to be in which the colonies were engaged that often, after the services of the Sabbath were over, he would repair to the courthouse and address the people on their duty to their country. He did not regard this as a desecration of the Sabbath, for though he felt that the services of the sanctuary were consecrated to divine worship, he yet believed that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Wow, that's kind of a different perspective compared to a lot of the pastors today, don't you think? Well, we'll have to you have to learn more about that and talk to your moms and dads and others as to what that really means. So let's continue on here. His pen was so devoted to the cause of his country, and he felt no measure untired to reach the ear and heart of the inhabitants of South Carolina. His enthusiastic patriotism and his great talents made him so prominent that the people, contrary to established usage, elected him member of the Provincial Congress. In 1775, the Tories in the back settlements began to assume such an attitude of decided hostility towards the friends of the Revolution that serious consequences were apprehended. To counteract their influence, the Council of Safety appointed Mr. TENNENT and William Henry Drayton a deputation to visit different portions of the state. They at once set out on their mission, and traveling through the back settlements, had private interviews with the people, and held public meetings at which Tennent addressed them in such burning eloquence that the adherents of the royal government trembled for their influence. Public meetings, private conferences, the formation of volunteer companies, and unceasing efforts to bring in the wavering and overawe the openly hostile occupied all his time and energies. The following extracts from his letters while on this mission will give a slight idea of his labors. In one of them, to Henry Lawrence, dated, quote, Bullock's Creek, August 20th, 1774, end quote, he says, after speaking of what others in conjunction with himself were doing, quote, I turned my course into the new acquisition, where I am to have a meeting from day to day in Colonel Neal's regiment. I think I shall fix this district in the right cause. I discovered on my way a scheme to surprise Fort Charlotte, took an affidavit of it, and sent it express to Mr. Drayton. So hope it will be prevented. I have formed one and am forming in this district another troop of volunteer horse rangers who are good as sworn to the Council of Safety when they enlist. We are hemming in the dissidents on all sides as such as possible, but their leaders seem determined, if possible, to bring the people to draw blood before they have time to be enlightened. I have forsook my chase and ride on horseback from day to day meeting the people, end quote. In another letter dated, quote, Long Cane, September 1st, addressed to the Committee of Safety, he says, quote, I thought it necessary to visit the settlements on this side of Saluda. Met a large congregation yesterday and found the people divided in their sentiments. Spoke at least 2 hours to them with good effect. The prevailing party here is for American measures, but they need confirmation. I have, therefore, appointed 3 meetings at which I expect to see a great number of the disaffected. I shall then cross over to Fletchel's regiment at once, to be at an election appointment at Ford's on the Emery, where we expect great opposition, if not violence, from Cunningham's party. Brown will bring them to blood if he can, but I still hope it may be prevented. I consider myself as running great risk, but think it my duty. End quote. He then speaks of the want of ammunition and adds, quote, I shall visit Charlotte before I return, and hope to let you hear more particularly on this subject next week. End quote. In executing this mission, he not only swayed the people by his eloquence, but by his shrewdness and sagacity broke up many dangerous plots and combinations. Returning to Charleston, he again took his seat in Congress, to which he was successfully elected. Says the Reverend Mr. Allison, who preached his funeral sermon, quote, both in the Provincial Congress and a General Assembly, he displayed great erudition, strength of argument, generosity of settlement, and a most unbounded eloquence. He continued his fervent endeavors to the last, resolutely regardless of the attacks of envy and calumny he met with. End quote. In 1777, his aged father died in Freehold, and the next summer he came north to take his widowed mother to his own home, that he might cheer and solace her declining years. On his return, when about 90 miles from Charleston, on the high hills of Santee, he was seized with a violent nervous fever which carried him rapidly to the grave. Just as the spirit was leaving his body, He remarked to the clergyman beside him that his mind was calm and easy, and he was willing to be gone. Thus passed away, as it were, on the very threshold of a great struggle in which his heart was so deeply interested, this young, eloquent, gifted, divine, and ardent patriot. Had he lived to the good old age of Dr. Witherspoon, he would, like him, have been not only one of the leading patriots, but one of the great intellectual lights of the country. It is rare that great personal beauty, impressive bearing, genius, eloquence, and piety are united in one man as they were in him. He was one of the few on whom nature seems to delight to lavish her choicest gifts. These were all sanctified and consecrated to God and his country. Very interesting story of William Tennent. And with that, it is always one thing that, first off, again and always I will say, is that we look to these men as very important as footnotes in history, and that we can have all different dispositions of how we look, how we're educated, how we talk, but what's most important is our relationship with God, and then how that becomes part of how we live in the world that we're brought into. So, with that, my children, I will let you go about Mr. Tennent, and we'll come back for the next chapter, which will be chapter 12, and we'll be talking about, and reading about rather, Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg.